Good day. After yesterday's dramatic events in the conflict in Ukraine, the situation today seems somewhat more calmer. We remain again in the quiet before the storm. In the vacuum of news, there's been again much discussion and talk about what is going on around the town of Liman or Krasny Liman in northern Donetsk. As of the time of the making of this video, it's not entirely clear precisely what has exactly happened. It seems that last night or yesterday afternoon, Russian reinforcements were sent towards the town, and it seems the most likely explanation is that their purpose was to withdraw the garrison from the town. Undoubtedly, as of this morning, Ukrainian troops have entered it, though there are some scattered and confusing reports that, in fact, parts of the garrison are still there and are still fighting. There's also some confused reports about the fact that more Russian reinforcements are moving towards this area. I'm not by any means sure whether that is the case, and if so, I'm not really entirely sure what the purpose of these reinforcements is. I think the reason for all this uncertainty is because news, as of the time of making of this video, is extremely unclear. I'm going to make a guess that by the time this video is published, we will have a lot more clarity about the situation. Regardless of that, I'm going to reiterate once more my own long-standing opinions about this battle, which are my own. Others are not under no obligation to share them. They can argue against them, they can dispute them if they wish. But in my opinion, Liman or Krasny Liman is a small place of little strategic importance. It has become, for Ukraine, a kind of obsession to capture this place in order for it to appear to maintain the momentum of its offensive in the remaining few days before the autumn rains close in and before the big Russian reinforcements arrive. And the result is that Ukraine has apparently stripped other parts of its front line, places like Soledar and Siversk, parts of their garrisons, despite these places being under continuous Russian attack, in order to try to capture Liman, which apparently has been ordered at any cost. And the result is that the Ukrainians have indeed made attempts to capture Liman, and for all I know, might even have done so if the reports about the withdrawal of the Russian garrison there are true. But the cost of all of this is disproportionate to the objective, a small, largely deserted town in northern Donetsk, one which I am sure is of little strategic significance. Now, as to the last point, I'm again going to say that's my opinion, that it is a place of little strategic significance, at least now. But of course there are others who have been recently, in the last couple of days, expressing the same opinions. One was Igor Girkin, aka Strelkov, who was in overall command of the Donetsk militia back in the 2014 fighting, and who knows this area and Liman itself well. And the other is the current Donetsk militia commander, Alexander Hodakovsky, who is in charge of the Vostok regiment, which is perhaps one of the best regiments in the Donetsk militia. Both of these people take the view that the correct decision, or appear to take the view that the correct decision is to withdraw the garrison, that the garrison remaining and fighting off Ukrainian attacks for almost 3 weeks has actually been extremely helpful from a Russian point of view, in that it has slowed the Ukrainian momentum after their successful offensive in Kharkiv to a trawl, and has obliged Ukraine to redeploy forces from all sorts of other places, weakening other battlefronts. And both seem to be of the view that the defense of Liman has served its purpose, and that holding out there with a small number of troops, allegedly about 500, against much larger Ukrainian forces, really serves no useful purpose from this point on. That is my view. Girkin and Hodorkovsky seem to share it or have similar views to mine. As I said, we'll just have to wait and see how events develop. Anyway, let's return to what I consider to be the more important news, which is the process of incorporation of the four regions into Russia. Now, yesterday, in my last program, I mistakenly said that they were, as of now, actually part of Russian territory. It's now absolutely clear that I've got the entire procedure for admission of these four regions into Russia completely wrong. And for that, by the way, I apologize about what I said about it in my recent programs. It seems that the correct sequence is this: 30th of September, i.e. yesterday, Putin signs an accession treaty for the four regions. He first, by the way, signed a treaty recognizing the independence of Kherson region and Zaporozhye region from Ukraine, and then he signed separate accession treaties for all four regions. Those accession treaties, signed by Putin and by the leaders of these four regions, are then referred on Monday to the State Duma, on Tuesday to the Federation Council. Once the Federation Council approves those treaties, they become law, and at that point, these four regions become part of the Russian Federation. The actual date when they become part of the Russian Federation is therefore not now, but 4th or 5th October 2022. So we've still got a few more days. And the Russians have now made absolutely clear, and of course Putin made absolutely clear in his speech yesterday, that if the Ukrainian troops remain in Donbass, then at that point the Russians will consider that this is an act of aggression against Russia, and the full might of the Russian armed forces will be unleashed to drive the Ukrainians out, and perhaps possibly to do more. Now, there's more and more news, more and more pictures of large convoys of Russian troops and equipment rolling into the four regions. Now, it's very difficult to get an exact sense of where all these reinforcements are going. But for what it's worth, my own impression is that they're not going to the north, they're not going to the area of the battles at Krasny Liman and those sort of places. I think the Russians feel that the situation there is being contained, however difficult it is. They seem to be heading south, principally to Zaporozhye and Kherson. And that does make me wonder what the plan might be, and whether perhaps the initial intention of the Russians is to keep pressing on with their advances in Bakhmut city and around Donetsk city, where the main fighting of the war continues, or whether possibly it might be to make a push to capture the important industrial city of Zaporozhye on the Dnieper River, the capital of Zaporozhye region, which is still under Ukrainian control. Now, this is a big city. It is the city where the Motorsich factory, which makes jet engines, gas turbines, all kinds of important equipment, is located. That's a major part of the Ukrainian military-industrial complex. And of course, if it were captured by the Russians, that would be a dramatic event, which would, shall we say, change perceptions at this particular moment about the nature of the war. The other possibility is that the Russians might also be planning some kind of strike towards Nikolaev. This is this important shipyard city on the southern Bug River in southern Russia, in southern Ukraine, west of Kherson region. The Russians have troops, or rather the militia apparently have troops, 15 to 20 kilometers from Nikolaev. And of course, Nikolaev is also something of a port. Were it captured again by the Russians, well, that would open the road for an advance to Odessa, where I suspect the Russians do eventually intend to go. But we'll just have to see. But of course, it may be that I'm entirely wrong, and these troops that I think are trundling towards the south are actually trundling towards the north. I'm never going to pretend that I have any great expertise in understanding or assessing film or pictures. Others are far better at that sort of thing than I am, and I'll just have to wait and see and decide what is going to happen. But anyway, one way or the other, from the 5th of October, the character of the war will change, and we will see, as I said, what the Russians do and what happens when, after the autumn rains and the softening of the ground starts to harden again, and all these reserves that the Russians are building up start to enter into the battlefields. On that particular issue, I get the sense, by the way, that the mobilization, the partial mobilization, has now essentially completed the process of calling up the reservists, and that what is now happening is that they're being sent to various training grounds in various places to be trained and brought back to the sort of condition where they would be fit to be used as combat soldiers, if that's what some of these reservists are going to be needed for. And some of these training camps are located in various different parts of Russia. One of them is in Chechnya. One of them is in Donetsk region, interestingly enough, very close to the front lines. Now, I want to stress again, I'm not convinced that every single soldier who's been called up will be sent into battle or even into those areas which were formerly Ukrainian. I suspect that a lot of them are going to take the place of professional units of the Russian army, still located on Russian territory, which haven't been allocated to the battle. And I do expect that one way or the other we will see large numbers of Russian troops entering the battle before very long. I mean, that seems logical. It's probably not all we're not going to see all of these forces appear at once. We're probably going to see a couple of thousand going in every day. Many of them may be filling up gaps in existing units. Many of these reservists may be filling up gaps in existing units, particularly I suspect in airborne units if it's ex-paratroopers who have been called up. But one way or the other, we will see a steady build-up of Russian force, of Russian military power in Ukraine before very long. Now, one additional little point I just wanted to make, which is that there's been a lot of focus upon the fact that some of these people need training, they need refresher training to bring them back up to the condition where they can fight. I suspect some of them will probably also need a great deal of fitness training, because I doubt that they've maintained the levels of fitness that the military expects whilst they've been in civilian life. But anyway, that's just a minor aside. Anyway, that's the situation on the battlefields up to this moment. What else is going on? Well, there was a meeting of the Security Council yesterday in which the United States and its allies sought to get past a resolution which would condemn the referendums in the 4 regions and the prospective annexation of these regions by Russia. The resolution failed because Russia, which has the right of veto on the Security Council, vetoed the resolution. What is much more important than that the Russians exercised their veto is who abstained. Now, a resolution of this kind is a very difficult thing for the country that is carrying out the annexations, because all over the world, every country is going to be very wary of appearing to endorse the conquest of one country by another country. The Mexican delegate who was attending the Security Council, for example, made a point that Mexico has lost much of its territory as a result of annexations by another country and cannot therefore support annexations in principle. And of course, the delegate didn't mention which country, but of course everybody knows that he was referring to the United States. An interesting comment for the Mexican delegate to make. So Mexico voted for the resolution, even though, as I said, its delegate did so, whilst throwing a barb at the United States, which was co-sponsoring this resolution. But a number of other countries refused to support the resolution, and they were the big 3. They were the big 3 non-Western powers: China, India, and interestingly enough, Brazil. Gabon also, by the way, refused to support the resolution. Now, they all gave the same reason. They say that they didn't think that the resolution as drafted was helpful in resolving the conflict, and they made it very clear that as far as they were concerned, they wanted to see peace negotiations. And again, that is something of a rebuke directed at the United States and at the Western powers, because it's well known around the world that it is the Western powers who have been pushing hard to prevent a negotiated solution to this conflict from happening. So the result is that the resolution failed because the Russians vetoed it, as they have the right to do, it didn't gain the support of the big non-Western powers: India, China, and Brazil. All, of course, by the way, partners of Russia in the BRICS group. And I understand that there is some irritation in the West about this. There were some hopes that apparently India or Brazil might support the resolution, which for the Russians would have been embarrassing. Now, next week, 10 days after the Security Council vote, as a result of certain changes that were made to United Nations General Assembly rules, there will be a session of the General Assembly at which this resolution will be proposed again, and there will be a discussion at the General Assembly at which the Russians will have to give and explain their reasons for the veto. The Russians will, of course, give their reasons for the veto. The fact is that from a diplomatic point of view, they have already achieved the main thing. They have kept the clear neutrality, the sympathy of the big powers: China, India, Brazil. We'll see whether the resolution is in fact put to a vote. It may be, but we'll just have to see. Anyway, that was what happened at the United Nations Security Council. I think the Russians, by the way, will be quietly relieved that the Security Council meeting went the way that it did, and that their key allies, China, India, and indeed Brazil, remained on side. And I think in the case of Brazil, where there's elections pending, it seems that both Bolsonaro, the current incumbent president, who many thought was pro-American, and his challenger Lula da Silva, are both more likely than not to continue with the existing policy that Brazil is following. So at the moment, I think, as I said, the Russians will be reasonably satisfied with the way things have been going in what was certain to turn out for them to be a difficult Security Council meeting, and what will no doubt be a difficult General Assembly meeting in 10 days' time. Now, in the meantime, lots of other things have been going on the economic front, and I'm getting the sense that there's now a general understanding in Europe that the economic situation there is starting to go hideously wrong. And it seems that the industrial production in Germany especially, but in some of the other EU countries, is now falling fast, even as the German government promises to enact further spending packages in order to prevent the economy from falling into a spiral of contraction and decline. Now, I have to say, that looks to me a little bit like the policy that the British government tried to enact a week ago, when it too announced a policy of tax cuts, supports for households who are trying to fight higher energy prices, and also general spending increases to try to keep the economy afloat. And what happened was that there were severe disruptions both in the British bonds market, the gilt market, and of course the sterling came under severe pressure. I'm not sure, in fact, I don't really see why with the EU it would be any different. Most probably, in fact, and highly likely, or so it seems to me, is that these spending programs that are being announced in Germany and elsewhere are going to start causing doubts about the underlying financial stability of the EU and perhaps of the Eurozone in particular, and that they will start to increase pressure, result in growing pressure on the euro, which is of course already trading below parity with the dollar. Now, if that happens, that combined with this extra spending is going to create a very paradoxical situation, which is that on the one hand, even as the European Central Bank, like the Bank of England, is trying to raise interest rates to counter inflation, at the same time, we're going to see huge increases in spending, which will add more demand, which will push up inflation, all at a time when supply is falling because industrial production is contracting. And by the way, agricultural production is contracting also. And at the same time as the currencies, the euro and sterling, are falling against the dollar, making the import of goods and commodities from outside the sterling area and the eurozone more expensive because they are still mostly priced in dollars. So it seems to me that this extraordinary mix of policies we have in Europe are going to make the recession worse, the inflation higher, and that we could start to see very quickly, in fact, a spiral which is going to start affecting the banking system as banks start to worry about the ability of some of their borrowers to meet their obligations. And we could start to see banks starting to respond to that in all sorts of complex and curious ways, not unlike what we saw in the 2007-2008 crisis. And by the way, there are now some market players who are talking about the fact that the situation in Europe is starting to resemble that in the late summer of 2007, when the situation has basically turned into one of a downward economic and financial spiral. Problem is, unlike 2007, 2008, there's no very obvious way out of this problem this time. QE has already been tried. Cutting interest rates is going to simply add to the inflation fire, which is what is burning through all these economies. And of course, it's become very difficult now to sort out the supply problems. Even if Europe was to suddenly lift its sanctions on Russia, with Nord Stream pipelines damaged, possibly soon beyond repair, how does the gas from Russia flow east in the quantities that flow west in the quantities that would be needed to stabilize energy prices? I have to say that, as I never quite felt in 2007, 2008, this is a crisis that I don't really see an obvious way out of. I think some people in European governments are beginning to understand this. I think European businesses and industries are starting to understand this. There were some very remarkable conversations between the new British Prime Minister Liz Truss and various people calling in from around Britain, and they were all basically telling her that the rise in interest rates that is now taking place is her fault and her government's fault. And she seemed somewhat bemused by this. She seemed to find this difficult to understand. But of course, ultimately, it is her fault, or at least it's the fault of not just her government, but all the other governments that have been involved in all of this. And of course, for people who are already paying very high prices for their everyday goods and who are going to undoubtedly be faced with higher energy costs, irrespective of the government's price caps. The cost of paying higher interests on their mortgages and credit debts is going to be extraordinarily high. I don't, as I said, have a clear idea of what policymakers in Europe are going to do. I do suspect that they will be calling frantically the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, asking it to slow down its pace of interest rate increases. But I'm not sure that the Federal Reserve Board is in any position to listen, because, to say it straightforwardly, prices, inflation in the United States are now rising also. I fear, in other words, that we are quickly approaching, perhaps even have passed, economically speaking, a point of no return. If that's right, and we start to get a really severe recession, perhaps even a depression in Europe, and one in which living standards for lots of people fall, I can't help but think, despite what some people are saying, that there will be a very heavy political backlash. This has come after a succession of economic shocks that the European public has experienced ever since the 2008 crisis. And I can't help but think that there will be a general loss of confidence in the European political class and in its leadership of Europe. I would also say that as far as the United States itself is concerned, certainly it is less affected by these events than Europe is. But Europe remains its biggest trading partner, and I think that eventually the spillover to the United States will come, and it will be severe. So, one way or the other, I think that this whole crisis over Ukraine is going to lead to very complex and turbulent times in the West. In the meantime, I doubt this is going to change the situation on the ground in Ukraine very much in the way the West wants. If the West, or at least the European part of the West, is in recession and depression, I have to say I think enthusiasm for supporting Ukraine is almost certainly going to dwindle, even if governments insist on continuing with it. In fact, I suspect that at some point, exasperation with those governments and their fixation with Ukraine is going to start to grow. I cannot imagine that won't find some political expression at some point, however hard the European elite tries to keep the situation, the political situation, under control. Anyway, that's my sense. I think that over the last couple of days, there is the mood, certainly in Britain, has darkened, and I'm getting the sense that it's beginning to darken significantly in Germany and in other parts of Europe as well. This could turn out to be a very difficult winter in Europe, a very difficult winter in Ukraine as well. I'm far from certain what will come out of it and what shape Europe will be in at the end of this process and what shape the world will be in as well. There's been, by the way, a very interesting editorial in Global Times. I'm not going to read it, it's very long, like most Global Times editorials are, but I will provide a link under this video, lamenting the incompetence and civility of Europe's leadership as it destroys Europe's economy and engineers deindustrialization on the European continent in order to serve American, well, perhaps not interests so much as obsessions. I think most of the rest of the world, China, India, all of these other places, are looking upon these events with bemusement and horror. And I think that Global Times editorial is simply one example of how many people around the world think. But anyway, whatever happens, I have to say for once, I'm not really sure in Europe what's going to happen, how we're going to come out of all of this. Whatever happens, I will be here to cover it. Thank you for joining me again today for this reasonably short video today. As I said, there's not been a huge amount of news. And remember, you can join us on our other platforms, Locals, Rumble, Odyssey, BitChute, Telegram. And if you join us on Locals, you can participate in my Locals live streams, which are exclusive to Locals. You can put any question you want to me there, and they take place at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time, 1900 hours London time. And if you want to support our work, you can do so via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And you should also check out our shop and think about buying for yourself all the great things you will find there: the magic mugs, the hats, the hoodies, the t-shirts, the sweatshirts, and all of those things. Lastly, before I switch off, I just want to say thank you to all of those people who've expressed support for me during my period of illness with my really disagreeable head cold. I should say that today is the first day that I've started to feel a little bit more like myself, though the cold is still there. Anyway, thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon, and have a very good day. And if you like this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Good day.